Welcome everyone to our ISPS webinar on internal family systems with Ron Unger, Stephanie Mitchell, and Thomas Holmes. I just wanted to say a word about ISPS. Maybe most people that are here know all about ISPS, but in case you don't, I'm the president currently. ISPS is the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. So it's quite a mouthful of a title for our organization. But just a little bit of history. We wanted to keep the acronym that we started with 70 years ago in Lausanne, Switzerland, which, by the way, in 2 years we will be having our international conference in Lausanne to celebrate our 70th anniversary. But when it started, it was an organization started by psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and it was called the International Symposium for Psychotherapy of Schizophrenia. So we would find that title outdated in a number of ways, or even offensive to some people these days. So our title evolved over the years, but I think going back to that original title, it definitely did convey something that's still important to us now, which is that that people that are experiencing psychosis are not a different brand of humanity, that they are us, that we are all human beings, and that the same approaches and talking therapy in the beginning and all the other approaches that we've developed now are applicable to people, to human beings, including people that are experiencing psychosis. So just to give you a flavor of where we came from, and that value continuing through the years up till today. What is very different now is that our organization, started by those psychiatrists, psychoanalysts with that vision, now we do include professionals of all kinds, which were not included in the early days, but we also include people with lived experience themselves, and family members or caregivers who are responsible for helping their people with experiencing psychosis. So our organization has expanded a lot in terms of who's included and of all the different kinds of approaches that that are being used across the world. We have just one other thing I want to mention is that we have chapters all over the world, and our website is at isps.org, but maybe some of you are joining from Australia, and there is an Australian chapter, and you can find them at ispsaustralia.com. There's also a New Zealand chapter, and you can find them at isps.org.nz. And I think we probably have a lot of people from the U.S. here too. And we're at the U.S. chapters at isps-us.org. I think with that introduction, I would just encourage any of you that don't know more about ISPS to go to the websites and see what we do and what we offer, and to possibly join. There's a quarterly journal, a scholarly journal that is put out by ISPS. There's a series of over 25 books through Routledge that we have, plus conferences in all the different regional groups and the international conference. So maybe that is enough of an introduction to ISPS and not to take up any more time. But I do just want to lastly thank you very much, Ron Unger, for organizing this for ISPS tonight. So thanks a lot. And I turn it over.
I appreciate our panelists being here to do this. But we're going to have discussion amongst the panelists, and then what we're going to have is we're going to address the questions. And so we ask that if you have a question that you're hoping to get to the panelists, to put that in the Q&A. You'll see on your menu on the bottom the Q&A button. So yeah. So I think to start out, what we're going to do is ask our panelists to say a little about themselves and kind of like what, including what got them into IFS and why they think it's important, just a general introductory overview of that. So does anyone feel called upon to start with that?
I can go first. Is that okay, Thomas? Yeah. So let me just clarify the question. You wanted to know a little bit about me and then also about how I got into IFS?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I started off working in mental health as a peer worker because I had my own experiences of what one of my incredibly articulate clients calls life-altering distress. And I like that phrase. From that place, that was a real gift to me, actually, to be in a place of being around peers and in a work environment where I was supported and valued for my lived experience. And so from there, I sort of went from peer work to support work to therapy, to being a therapist. And all through that time, I worked with people who had experiences of voice hearing and other things that, people can't necessarily perceive themselves, but this is what these people are having these experiences of. And so the main thing that drew me to, I was just where I worked, that was what happened. I was exposed to working with people like that and having those experiences. And so for me, the thing that was really striking was just how badly people are treated and how no one really listens and tries to understand. So kind of that's the sort of the pathway into working with psychosis. So I'm a counsellor in Australia and I'm level 3 trained IFS. I have my own pretty significant trauma history. And so my interest in IFS came from being a therapist who was really feeling like the things that I was doing with clients just wasn't that helpful. I've had a long history in the Hearing Voices movement, and I co-facilitated a Hearing Voices group for a number of years. Have done all manner of different, presenting nationally, internationally, and ran trainings and things like that. And it always felt that there was something that I just felt dissatisfied in what I was offering my clients and that it wasn't enough. And then I found out about IFS and as a therapy modality from one of my colleagues where I was working at the time, and was going to go off and train in it. But then I realized I need this for me. So I actually got interested through becoming a client. Once I kind of heard about the theory of it, I started as a client. And so I've had my own long journey, about 700 sessions of IFS. And it has been an incredibly, I've had 10 years of therapy before IFS and felt like it was a lot of struggle town, a lot of thinking and trying to reframe and a lot of up from top down kind of processes of trying to make myself feel differently. And IFS has just allowed me to feel different from within my body. It feels like not something I have to do or think. Change doesn't occur from outside. It sort of happens from within inside of my body is how it feels. So I came to IFS from that place and then did the training during the process of my healing. I've been training. So that's a bit about me.
Cool. Thanks, Stephanie. So I'm Tom Holmes. I work at a first episode psychosis program here in Montreal. I've been here at that program for 20 years now, since almost its founding, a little bit after. In the past, so is in the context of being a social worker and therapist, with, I tried CBT with certain folks, and it's just like, no, this is not gonna work. And was always drawn more to ACT, acceptance commitment therapy initially. Did a bunch of trainings in that, more or less the same time, discovered compassion focused therapy, which resonated more in many ways, but still had some like, okay, both of these are very too much up here in the head, for me. And so 5 years ago, within that 20 years at this first episode program, 5 years ago, I started at, we have a mini program for those supposedly at risk of psychosis. So they might be having most of them have low level or attenuated psychosis-ish experiences. They don't really cross whatever threshold to say, oh, you have a psychotic disorder, we're going to give you meds, but you have something like that, voices or some paranoia, but with insight or less effect on functioning. So it's people seeking help for themselves mostly. And it turns out, interestingly, in this clientele, when you actually ask about trauma and dissociation, they've got a lot of it. And, despite the hundreds of papers saying, including by where we work, that you need to ask for trauma, it just doesn't happen. And especially with dissociation, it just doesn't happen. Psychiatrists are often trained to pretend dissociation doesn't happen. But anyway, with this clientele, they have a lot of dissociation, either in terms of very, distinct parts as voices, or some personalities experience not necessarily as perceptualized, but also a lot of depersonalization and derealization. And so a lot of the work in the past 5 years is like, oh, okay, some people with stuff that's, talking in terms of parts, it's like, okay, I have been exposed a little bit to IFS, like at a conference 10 years ago. And went, oh, well, yeah, I got to learn this. So 3 years ago, got some training from IFSCA, because they have a cheaper, but still very good, but not certified, training online. So I took that. And since then, 3 years, have been using IFS with my own therapist for my own stuff. And I've found it to be way more helpful than any other modalities I've ever tried for my own stuff. Yeah. And clients, I don't know, maybe this is a pitch for this kind of clientele. There's supposed to be, I don't know, 10%, 15% who have their psychotic-like symptoms worsen to cross a threshold. In our clinic, it's probably less than 5. It's probably actually less than the general population of this age group. So it's like, okay, we have the same criteria. We're screening people with the same instruments and all that. But somehow this seems to be an approach that really works for folks. So that's really quite encouraging. So yeah, so I do that, and I also have private practice. So
my background, well, I guess it kind of started as a young person. I had experiences that a lot of people would have identified as psychosis, or actually I did at the time, because I was studying psychology and I was aware, hey, this is what they're calling psychosis. But I was also reading people like R.D. Laing that said hey, psychosis can be a good thing. And so I took that as just a journey. And it worked for me, but then my siblings went through something similar and did get dragged into the mental health system. So I was just saying, I became a mind freedom activist. We need better treatment. But then the system was saying, we don't know what else to do. So I decided to study. And at first, what I got into is CBT for psychosis, which I think has a lot of good ideas. But then I was always trying to expand it, and what else? And what about the people where you're not connecting with, or how can you go deeper with it? and definitely got interested in doing trauma work alongside that. And done a lot of, including studying typical dissociation theory and stuff like that. And then studied things like compassion focused therapy, which really brings in the vital role of compassion and open dialogue, which I think really stresses being open to looking at things in different perspectives more than one way. Maybe nobody has the whole truth when we need different voices and letting all the voices be heard. And that's really important. And then kind of like people at my agency started talking more about IFS. Actually, I'd read about it a little earlier, but it was people at the agency getting interested. And I started, seeing and then thinking about, hey, how can that apply and maybe deepen some of the work with psychosis? And because IFS does have a lot of ideas about how to work with parts. And I was already very aware that people obviously have a lot of different stuff going on and they can shift right in a session. They're just headed one way and you're talking to them and all of a sudden they're headed a completely different way. Wait, what happened? Another part took over. And I think IFS has some good ways of working with that and noticing. And IFS, it has both the ability to work with parts, but it also has the ability to work with the aspect of the person that isn't broken into pieces, that they call the self with a capital S. So it really has a kind of like a twin thing, which I think is really helpful to that because there's an old saying, and comes from mysticism, not one, not two. And I think that really plays into IFS because we're not just our parts and we don't just have one unitary self. We kind of have both. And that's a real richness to IFS. And it brings that into practical functioning. So that's why I think I'm intrigued by the model. Yeah. So what's, maybe you guys want to address like in what's unique sort of like in working with parts within the kind of experiences that get called psychosis, and how have you seen it to be promising so far? What would you like to say about that?
If it's okay, Stephanie?
There you go.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. So interestingly, with this clientele, it's hard to know if it generalizes, although I do think it probably does for people who go on to have like a psychotic disorder diagnosis, like they've crossed whatever threshold, right? Okay, so for the folks who don't know the basic model, there is this idea of a sort of basic central, I would say sort of balanced self in IFS, which is if they act, it's like you have this center of experience, point of view from which you experience, or mindfulness, or phenomenological approaches, and a sort of a field of awareness of different parts or emotions or complexes, depending on the language you want to use. And this sort of central balanced self can be a lot like an eye of a hurricane. So if there's a lot of storm happening of different parts responding to current situations or responding to current situations as if they were traumatic, difficult periods from the past, it's possible to find that balance and then help the parts. Now, there's many different parts and not all of them are different, problematic. You may have playful parts, you may have other parts that are just like, they're just there, right? And they're not necessarily problematic, but in terms of therapy, IFS talks also in, self, but also 3 kinds of parts. So 2 kinds of protector parts and parts that are more exiles and have been carrying, the exiles in particular have been carrying burdens of shame, isolation, loneliness, trauma, rejection, all that kind of feeling, disgust and put into exile. And protectors keep exiles in exile through either being proactive, and those kind of parts are called more managers, because they're like trying to keep on top of things and prevent exiles and their burdens and all their pain from coming too close, and from that pain of coming too close. And also protecting those exiles from further harm. Okay. And so there's this sort of managers are trying to protect from by being proactive. And I'll come back to a distinction I add actually to that, as well as more reactive protectors who are like, you are getting too darn close to all that pain that an exile, maybe a young kid, maybe a part that was traumatized in something that happened after childhood as well, bullying, or especially interpersonal violence or intentional harm, or betrayal and or invalidation. And if that exile part carrying all that hurt is too close to the surface, you're going to have a firefighter come in to try to either put out the fire, rescue, et cetera, maybe coming from fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? But in a reactive way. I kind of make a distinction between, and this is, people who know the ACT, especially the ACT matrix, might relate to this. Both of those kind of protectors, and how I present things to folks, and they kind of go, oh yeah. Both of them have, both the reactive and the proactive, they have a go towards energy or a pull away energy. So a go towards manager would be, the functioning in daily life part of oneself. A manager taking care of things, proactive coping, managing your budget, managing health, blah, 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 managing family, just the stuff one needs to do, but not necessarily taking care of the ouch, right? Because their job is like, I need to manage life. And often they're very, very highly functional, okay? Professionally or in daily life and family, et cetera. But there's also a pull away and watch out for stuff that might be coming. So they have their go towards manager, and you got to like, whoa. And that would be things like anxiety, or if one way to understand psychosis, or parts of psychosis anyway, is watching out for threat, like hypervigilance to danger and threat, and to powerful others who would be intrusive and taking over. And for me, a lot of psychosis, not all of it, but a lot of it, the more distressing part is the extreme version of threat vigilance, externally, socially, and internally. Okay, signals of like there's a threat coming, but and often these two are really having an intense tennis match, bouncing off each other. Okay, and the same applies that go towards and pull away energy, or dynamic, applies to reactive ones. So you have ones, they're going to respond with anger, like, oh yeah, this neighbor really hates me, I'm going to confront them, for example. But it can also be like, I have clients who are particularly in traumatic environments where they have like a rescuer part who goes into like, yeah, mom was stabbing dad and I'm 5 years old. Yeah, I'm like, my response as a 5-year-old is to go in and intervene and try to keep these people from killing each other. That kind of, so it's a go towards, but it's not like a fight. It's like go in to save and rescue. And there's also, sometimes it's proactive, sometimes more reactive, like a fawn response, like, yeah, fine, right? But that all of these do feel very dissociated from the exile. And the reactive, fear-based, not seeing it coming, but like, oh, whoa, would respond with kind of dissociation, like, oh, I'm not here, I'm getting out of here, or escape, or literally trying to escape, or in panic mode. So people with panic disorders, they don't necessarily have trauma, or light-ish trauma, but they're more likely to have depersonalization, derealization, for example, right, in terms of dissociation. Now, what in this clientele that I work with, I see a lot, and also people who transitioned later in the process of getting more psychosis. And I always come back to this one person I was working with like almost 20 years ago, who had a tattoo. She was in her early 20s, had a tattoo with her boyfriend and some Chinese symbol saying, like on her arm, saying eternal love. No, I didn't speak Chinese, nor read it, neither did they. But anyway, that's beside the point. When they were like really close to each other, kind of fusional, they would have like, oh, it feels so great to have this expressing our love, right? But they have a kind of a rocky relationship. So sometimes it's like this, and sometimes it's really close, really yo-yo. When they were pulling apart, that symbol, like I feel distance from the boyfriend. Thus, I feel distance from the symbol. And then it spread to her arm. It's not my arm. Like I still move it, blah, 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 blah. So there's this really localized depersonalization, somatically, very easy to understand, right? And that may be, intensified with a certain, insecure attachment style from her background. So there's this exile that might be more sensitive to that kind of rejection. And then there's this protector that's reactive of dissociating, like, this is not my arm. But then, other times they were having sex and like she'd be worrying that he's thinking about, this other girl they both know while they're having sex, right? So then there's like a normal jealousy. Both of these things are totally understandable, right? Non-psychotic, one more dissociative, one just sort of regular worries and an insecure attachment and an on and off relationship. And so I was meeting her weekly and she was talking about these processes, but then at some point, the two problems got mixed together. So it was not only not her arm, like depersonalized, it was like nobody else's arm until that point, but then it became, what if it's this other girl's arm? Right? And so you get these worry processes kicking in, like, oh my God, what if it is hers? How would that happen? Why? Blah, blah, blah. Right? And it opens a whole door to something that, we call psychosis. Right? But it was interesting to see how it got constructed, and it actually makes sense. So in a way, if we use this model of, she's functioning fine, but she's got this anxiety, who's looking for patterns for threat and for explanations for a dissociative experience that her regular functioning mind would be like, doesn't make sense to me. But then her scanning for threat and who's the powerful other came up with an explanation for the dissociation. And it's neither the dissociation in her context, somatic depersonalization, nor the worry per se, but it was really the combo that made it psychotic-y. So it's really these interactions, and this is what's interesting with IFS is, yes, you have this balanced self, but you have these different parts that are really interacting with each other, sometimes in really intense ways, that can, in certain ways that they interact, can go to a level that we call psychosis. Like this depersonalization of certain aspects of your experience. Like there's so many ways that personalization shows up. M.S. Cernes, she's a psychologist at Birmingham, does a really nice breakdown of depersonalization, derealization. But you look at that, like unfamiliarity, disconnection, not mine, could be body experiences like the person I'm talking about, but it can also be thoughts. Like, yeah, I have these thoughts that come to mind. They don't feel like for me. And the person has not yet said, oh, there's this part of me that does these thoughts. But if you add to that, it's not from me, it's from somebody that's threatening out there in the world, coming from this anxious explanation place, then you can definitely get psychosis, right? And this is a little bit with, CBT for psychosis. It leans on those explanations, those anxious explanations, and talks about anomalous experiences, but it doesn't elaborate very well what those anomalous explanations are, which are pretty much dissociation, and my idea of things. And so helping people sort of map it out like this, often what we do in IFS is you get permission from the person, can I do a little bit of mapping with you? And if the person relates from a place of, yeah, we can talk in terms of parts, that's cool. If they don't, that's fine. Like a function of your mind would do this, or an aspect of your personality does that. Whatever works for them, right? Because you don't have to be hard and fast on this is the language. But then mapping it out in these different kind of parts and how they're interacting, it helps them actually come back to their center to use ACT language, defuse from, to use IFS language, unblend from these particular parts, and especially the intense dynamic between them, and then work with one part after another. So that's my little nutshell blurb on that. Yeah.
All right. Stephanie, did you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, so I'm appreciating the overview of IFS. For me, what I was really wanting to speak to, there's a couple of things. We talk about self having certain qualities, the self energy of the client, this kind of core of this is who I am, right? I'm having these other experiences and I feel conflicted and I feel confused. And when I have felt most crazy and I'm like, oh my God, I'm losing my mind, it's always a polarization between my parts, wanting completely opposite things and also needing to know completely opposite things. And so I will literally have a part who's like, that is not me. And another part who's like needing me to understand and know something. And when I can't tolerate the difference, I'm feeling crazy. So for me, when we think about the qualities of self, one of the qualities of self is clarity. And so when Thomas talks about he talked about the unblending or diffusing. I like to call it differentiation. That I'm not someone who is a pathetic, needy person who everyone will hate because of my neediness. And I'm also not only the strong person who doesn't need anybody. I have both of those parts, and they hate each other, and they're both wanting such opposite things, and so much fear about having any need at all because of the trauma in my childhood, that the one who says I have to be alone and I have to need nothing and never ask hates the one who so needs that. It's very young. It's like in my system pre-verbal. And so it's like this need has to be completely disowned. And yet, who wants to live alone? Like the agony of the aloneness that the choice of that protector had to make is unbearable. And, and so for me, helping the client to map that, to map out and hear the parts who are at war with each other, brings clarity, which is a quality of self, right? It also brings some compassion, because as soon as you differentiate a little bit, you realize, God, how horrible is that? These two parts of myself, but either believe they have to be completely alone or somehow be this pathetic, needy, like there's no in between for my system, right? That's what feels so crazy. And so what do I want to say about IFS? So that's kind of springboarding off what Thomas was saying. But what I want to say broadly about IFS is that for me, and psychosis in particular is what I wanted to come to, is that I believe that the person who's having this experience has grown up with a lot of messages about not being allowed to say and know certain things. And so whether that's socially, whether that's in a religious context, whether that's parents, whether that's really early developmental wounding, whether that's a developmental stage where I'm starting to come into something in my teenage years that, might mean that I'm isolated from my social group, whether you look at it through the Power Through Meaning framework, which talks about how power has been, how I felt powerless in places. But there's something that's kind of like part of me wants to be known. And in IFS, we would say the exile holds some pain and knowing, and another part can't tolerate it. And then in the way of, like Thomas talked about, the go towards and pull away, from my way that I think about IFS and psychosis, or I see my clients who have these experiences through an IFS lens, is maybe a better way of explaining what I'm trying to articulate, that what I'm seeing is a part wants something to be known, a part can't have something to be known. So I say it to you in a way that's coded so that hopefully if you're a safe enough person, you'll get it. And if you're not a safe enough person, I'm protected. And also I'm doing that for my sake too, because I can't know it.
Mhm.
And so there's this sort of way of communicating something. And, we think about someone who has, I think of dissociation on this. We all know dissociation's on a spectrum, right? The most mildest form is daydreaming, all the way down to what we think is diagnosed as dissociative identity disorder. I think psychosis is pretty down that end of dissociation. The difference for me is that with someone who ends up with a DID diagnosis, they're kind of very easily able to identify their trauma. And the person who's having an experience that we call psychosis, I think, has much harder time putting the pieces because of this I'm not allowed to know something piece.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I have those experiences where my part's like, I don't want to know. They'll tell my IFS practitioner, I don't want to know the pain that's in there. I don't want to know certain things about who I am. So I think that it's just about in IFS, we can look at, I really want to speak for this before we move on to anything else, because this kind of encapsulates everything for me. We can look at the protocol and we can have a lot of concerns about it. It seems like it's a very protocolized approach, right? But actually, when I'm with a client, I'm holding the model here and I'm being in relationship, like Thomas talked about before we actually came on the call. We were talking about how to, as a therapist, the main thing I'm doing is holding my own self-energy with a client. And so it's like, I'm here with you knowing a part of you wants something to be known, and knowing another part is terrified, and knowing that whatever has to be said needs to be moved towards by one part, pulled away by another, and then coded through something that needs to be sometimes a little opaque. And so what I'm going to do is I'm, as a therapist, going, I hear and I see you because some part needs me to hear and see. And if I do what every other person out there does, which is you don't make sense to me, that's really scary to the person. I'm going to say it does make sense, but then my sense making might be confrontational because, of course, the part who has to disown it is going, no, don't see or know me. I'm not even ready to see or know me. Oh my God. And so then what I do is I go, oh, that's okay. Let's back away from that. So for me, there's kind of like, as a therapist, I'm holding my self-energy around, I'm here hearing and reflecting you. And when it's too much, let's just pull away and take a break, and knowing it always comes back around. So that's kind of how I see the IFS process. And then once the person goes through enough of that, and there's what I call relational safety, it's like that whole first year or whatever, 2 years, however long it takes for a client to feel safe with me, not going too intrusively towards them. Then we start to get into more of the IFS proper, where we're maybe doing, some of these unburdenings and the things that IFS talks about. But so that's my nutshell of how I see psychosis and IFS working.
Yeah, it's definitely what you're talking about, like communicating and yet not wanting to communicate really reminds me of when I was young. If you met me then, I was doing a lot of that, driving everyone who knew me. What's wrong with them? But that really is it. And it might be they got the messages they weren't supposed to know something, or it was just too hard for them to know something. Like Eleanor Longden talked about things happening to her that she tried to bury, but unfortunately she buried it alive. And so it came back out. And so it's often something that the person doesn't want to think about. And yet, of course, a part of them thinks it's essential that they think about it. And so it will come out in whatever form it needs to. And then it gets denied and pushed back and changes the way it looks. But by being curious about it and looking at the fact that there's different parts and different reactions and just noticing the diversity and maybe starting to map it out. And depending on where people are at, I mean, Stephanie, you talked about a year to develop safety. I mean, some people come in and are ready for different kinds of work, but yeah, it might be really slow, or it might be somebody's really ready to take a big step. Who knows? And sometimes people, one of the beauties of IFS, it doesn't just see all the magic in its eye. The great therapist with my compassionate heart will heal you, but it's more like, hey, I'm going to try to be in my compassionate place, but I know that you have the ability to be in your compassionate place towards yourself and towards your parts. And I have a few clues, even though that might be hard for you to do. I have a few clues on how you can do that. And that has really a lot of power. Of course, that's common in compassion focused therapy also has that, but IFS has a few different, ways of doing that. And, but that's really essential. And sometimes people kind of find that self right in the middle of something. Like Thomas, as you were talking, you were talking about how the eye of the hurricane, and it reminded me of Pat Deegan talking about one of her psychotic experiences where she was just feeling like a kite torn in the wind and just totally out of control. And all of a sudden she heard the voice of God, and the voice of God said, "You are the one who is flying the kite." And all of a sudden, it's like she came to an IFS term, she came to self and realized, oh, I can relate to all these different states of the kite. And IFS has this thing that I've heard Richard Schwartz call the magic question. And the magic question is like when you're trying to work with, let's say, the hurt part of the person, but then you ask the person, well, how do you feel towards that? And that really, brings out that if the person is not in their compassionate space, they'll be feeling angry or ashamed or not wanting to have it and stuff like that. And so that is something within IFS that I really think helps you figure out what's going on. Or if let's say the person is trying to relate, you've tried to guide them to relate in a compassionate and kind way towards that part of themselves, and all of a sudden that part of themselves starts clamming up or not wanting to talk, that's when you ask that magic question again, and you usually find out, oh, I'm feeling bad at it, or I'm scared of it again. And that's what it's reacting to. So it's this very relational thing. And I have found, I think sometimes my clients, are maybe a little more disorganized than some of Richard Schwartz's clients, because I get parts to agree to step back, and a minute later they're back in there causing trouble. Which often means you have to work with the part that, even though it says it would step back, you have to turn and work with it before it's really ready to step back. So anyway, those are my kind of jumbly thoughts about this. Maybe I could just ask, what else is coming up as what's really important with IFS about psychosis specifically? I know psychosis can involve like people feeling that others are directly sending stuff into their mind, or that their thoughts are going out all over the place. And but what strikes you as especially important about IFS, or also even about any particular challenges that come up for IFS, like with psychosis as compared to other kinds of, working with IFS with other kinds of things? There may be special challenges with working with psychosis. I'm curious what comes up.
I think one of the main things, the way it's interesting, it's funny because I have a very strong mapper. I call it my mapper part of mine. It's a little bit like Dora the Explorer with her map, who likes to have like a map thing, like combining as many theories as possible. It's fun. One of the key things, like we were both talking about, all three of us talking about, is being like noticing when the therapist or helper has certain reactions to what's going on with the person in front of them, or a countertransference, as a general term, and to notice our own reactivity of anxiety, like, I don't know what to do with this. This is like, or I can't follow this. Like, mappers want to like, this made no sense. And Stephanie, you were talking about some of the key qualities that just happen to be all starting with the letter C, of self, right? And compassion clearly is one of them. Clarity is another one. But clarity doesn't necessarily know, like, I know what's going on. Right? It's not necessarily I know what's going on, because another C is curiosity. And my background before going into social work was I'm an anthropologist. So I still relate to my clients as like, I don't know what's going on here. Somebody has a different metaphysics right? And they may be communing with some divine thing, right? Or for them, that's what's going on for them. And they bring that up with their family members, or they bring that up with their psychiatrist, and they're like, you're crazy. We need to increase your meds, right? But, if the person is not causing distress or having their own distress, and their functioning level is nothing to do with that, then like, why, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But they do, in the kind of ultra secular society that we have, it's hard for them to find a place where somebody's going to be just listening and curious and wanting to understand what their reality is like, right? And that's essential. And that's, I think, for our staying in a curious stance with compassion, but with a lot of like, I just want to be clear and understand what's going on for you. Because sometimes I've worked with people some people for a long, long time, and they no longer have distress, but they still have a very different reality from everybody around them. And they may be looking online or finding their own resources. And sometimes it's really inspiring. One guy I work, well, I don't really work with him anymore. We just see each other occasionally. Very spiritual guy, master's in philosophy. And he has voices, spirits, whatevers that come to interrogate him. But they're not necessarily nasty, but they've got a lot of stuff going on for them. And he, like on his own, in his own spiritual work, makes his mind and in his meditation practice like a healing temple for whatever these things are, to come and do their business, heal, and move on with total patience. So he's like cultivating like compassion and openness and clarity for whatever these things are, beings. He has his own framework for explaining them, which is now moving also towards like a spiritual framework that is also moving towards a trauma informed, which is like, cool, dude. And for me, having these dialogues with him, like, I'm just curious. And curiosity is like, you want it, like, I want to be surprised, right? And even inspired by people. And to have somebody relate to us that way, like, we're not in a protocol of fixing anything. There's an interesting notion in IFS that really can affect, that sort of go towards and avoid problems part, that we call a self-like part. It has a lot of self-energy. It has a lot of these C's, but it doesn't like curiosity. It likes predictability. It likes to understand what the hell's going on. It likes to have a certain feeling of control. And it can be like a controlling, caring person. We all know people like that. They're like really caring, but it's like, yeah, I'm not going to open up with you because you're going to be in my face and intrusive about my stuff. And I don't know if I can trust you with this. Like you were saying before, Ron, like, for example, sometimes parts will get out of the way, and then, you get close to something, and then it like, whoa, right? Because it can detect, like, if somebody's not sincere, but they have an agenda, like, nobody wants to be controlled. And we can feel that, especially if you have a lot of trauma history. Our antennae for that is really strong. And one of the weird and problematic things in psychiatry, of course, is it's a very risk averse and control. Get rid of experience. We got to get rid of these. These are meaningless epiphenomena. Get rid of them. It's like a rash. It doesn't mean anything. Just get rid of it, right? Whereas people are fascinating, like really fascinating. And to be open and working with them, I learn so much. Like, yeah, I've learned a lot from reading, but I learn way more by working with people. And so that's one of the aspects of IFS that I just love, is that openness. And often people are like, oh, okay, yeah, I can talk about, yeah, I think I'm connected with some sort of divine being, and you're not freaked out. And there may be like nasty superpower beings, and I don't know how to relate to them. And then so often it's like, okay, how do we help you get back to your center? Whatever another one in there with the C's is creativity. Because in that curiosity, you're walking with somebody if they're willing and they're curious and have enough self-energy that they're going in and kind of giving you, heads up every few minutes of like, when you ask them, well, what are you noticing now inside? What's going on? They come up with things that you really did not expect and they didn't expect. And often very interesting insights. And just being able to curiously walk that terrain with them as they, like you're both saying, is there's intrinsic healing capacity in the person, especially when they come into that more balanced, centered self. And then they're noticing these different parts coming up, and maybe their first reaction is like, what the hell is that? And a sense of disgust. And sometimes like there's something in me that really doesn't feel like it's from me. I don't know. Is it from an abuse thing? I don't even know. And there's like a thinker part that absolutely, like an investigator, has to figure out where the hell this came from. Maybe it's a pre-verbal thing. Maybe it's who knows what else. And sometimes some of the process is it okay to get this thing in front of you? You don't have to get rid of it, but just so like you can feel safe and less discussed, but just at a distance, maybe in a little imaginary force field. So it's just there and you can witness it and see if there's anything else inside that's connected to this, right? So we're really accompanying people as they go into these very symbolic or imaginal realms. Like, and in that process can be incredibly healing. I mean, I also personally like it just because, my brain just thinks in metaphors and visual stuff and, interoceptive things. That's how my system works. So it's actually kind of one of the challenging things with IFS, I find, is that learning and helping the other person learn their own internal language of how their parts present themselves. Because sometimes they will not be verbal. Sometimes they will not be visual. Sometimes they will be body sensations or anything. And so tapping into some Gestalt ways of like, does this part have, or does this body sensation feel heavy or spiky, or if it had a texture or whatever, or heat, or all these sort of physicalizing it, right? Because really, the personification of parts or complexes in IFS is really helpful, but sometimes you're not getting a personification, you're getting like a physicalization, if that makes sense.
And I think that's not only Gestalt though, Thomas. I think that is an IFS thing. We do ask body parts, what does your leg tell you? So I just wanted to distinguish. We do really, we don't have to just personify. It can be, I had an entire unburdening with Dick Schwartz on my left leg that was telling me something about something very important. So, I think
exactly.
I think that the creativity is really important. So, I have a whole heap of things to say from your question, Ron, and also from Thomas. I'm also aware of time because we said we'd go for an hour and then switch to questions. But you had a two-pronged question. One was the challenges, and I forgot what the first bit was, Ron. Do you remember?
I wanted to something kind of like just more about like IFS specifically for psychosis, like especially some of this the states where people like maybe feel like their thoughts go out to others, other people's coming into them, that whole dynamic and how that relates to IFS, and also what might be especially challenging with IFS with psychosis generally. So
I made myself a note and then I didn't know what my note meant. So the thing that I wrote when you asked that question was, for me, I'm always listening for themes. Okay. So for me, for what I'm kind of gathering is when somebody's telling me about my thoughts go out into other people, or their thoughts come into me, or these other, whatever the experience they're having is, okay. For me, it's not they're not really telling me about that experience. They're telling me about something else, and I have to listen for the something else. Okay. Because my thoughts going out to someone is metaphor for some other sense of powerlessness, of feeling controlled, maybe meaning making. I think Thomas and I, one of our, because we do peer supervision, and he mentioned to me once about pattern formation, that, and maybe you can mention in a minute, Thomas, just very briefly, because I'm aware of time, the paper that you were talking about, psychosis and pattern formation, and how pattern formation and anxiety in the psychosis space are kind of like jumbled. But my point is, what I'm listening for is there is actually an important knowing or theme that the person has kind of put together a whole bunch of things, like Thomas was talking about the tattoo in the arm, that there's like, I'm afraid, but I don't know how to put that together. And the actual thing that's important is, if we listen to that person with the tattoo, I'm thinking, okay, so there's some sense of, I want to be close and I'm afraid, and when it's distant, it's scary to me. Okay. And then how do I make sense of that? And then if I externalize my confusion or my fear or my wanting to be close and also wanting to be separate through the tattoo, and then that kind of this pattern formation, then it becomes the arm. For me, I'm not really that interested in, of course, I'm interested in the tattoo, or I'm interested in the arm, or I'm interested in how the thoughts get transferred to the other person, or vice versa. I think with psychosis, as a therapist, I want to be acutely interested in that. I'm not saying that I'm uninterested from the perspective of I'm not going to ask the client about it or not bring a lot of attention to their experience, because I do want to do that. What I'm not interested in is that as a standalone experience. I know that thing is related to something very important that's a theme. And the theme is a much bigger thing in the person's life. And so after I've spent a fair bit of time asking about, tell me about that. When did you first start having this experience of my thoughts are being conveyed to other people, or their thoughts are being conveyed to me? And then as we unpack that more and more, I will start to hear the story behind the story. Okay. And sometimes clients can, even though they're not even aware of it, they tell you anyway. It's like there's what's his name? There's a guy, what's the thought unknown? We can't think of it. Anyway, there's a particular theorist who's written some great stuff, and he talks
Donald
about
Stern.
No, it's not Donald Stern. I've got his book here and I can't remember, but he talks about the fact that we know something, but it hasn't come up to awareness yet. It's almost like the felt unknown, but that is known. And I'm frustrated at myself. My parts are frustrated.
It might be Christopher Bolus. Somebody put that in the comments.
Yeah, Christopher Bolus, he talks about that. And so there's like, they are telling me something that up until the point they get to tell me, they weren't even aware of it. But now it's like, oh yeah, that's 100% true. So I'll say, how long have you had that experience of my thoughts go out? And they'll be like, well, since my dad used to sexually abuse me, and I was sure that he could read my mind when I was afraid. I mean, that's a pretty big example. Most people don't come with that as your first thing, because it's too big a jump. They'll tell you something much more subtle at first. But that's what I'm talking about. And I was making the big examples to kind of make it really obvious. So for me, when you talk about whatever your question was, Ron, I'm always listening for themes because I can't remember the question, but that was the thing that brought up for me is whatever the presentation, whatever the person's bringing, I want to be acutely interested in their inner world. I want to be acutely interested in their experience. And then I want to say, how long has it been going on for you? Let's listen to the theme underneath, which is about powers. Someone's thoughts coming into me has some early thing that has a meaning to it. The second thing that I want to speak to is about Challenges, for me, there's a bunch of challenges. If you learn IFS and you think you can just do the model on people, you're going to be very challenged with psychosis because, I mean, I even find the feel towards question problematic. It is a magic question, but we don't expect parts to step back, even if they agree to step back,
Mhm.
because they don't. We have to, the challenges for me are stay long enough in the model. When I first learned IFS, I had no idea how to apply it to my psychotic clients. And I would constantly turn up to my supervision and just go like, ah. And so I had to really stay long enough to really learn, have my clients teach me, embody the model enough to realize that, I very rarely ask feel towards Ron, but I have much more nuanced ways of asking the same type of question. And the main thing that I'm doing as I'm bringing myself energy to the client, they naturally piggyback off that and they have their own self energy. So I'm not really focusing so much on having them necessarily, especially early on, trying to even access their own self energy. It's sort of like it just happens. It appears as we get clarity or compassion or curiosity. So that's kind of one of the challenges, I think, is people think that they can kind of like do the protocol and they'll get the result. But actually, I think that we have to be very nuanced with IFS when we're working with psychosis. The other thing I will say, and Thomas, I don't know if we've got time. I think we need to stop for questions. But
Yeah.
Thomas did just mention quickly about spirituality.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So, and I'll try. I have an example of somebody that comes to mind, because it's both for the spirituality question and the pattern finding thing that we were talking about another time, as well as the intrusive thoughts, and as well as like other people know me, because sometimes it is a power scary dynamic. And I'm thinking about a guy who is a refugee and stuck here, um, and homeless, and so his stress levels were just like through the roof, right? And somebody who had difficulty functioning before that, and he was not particularly religious or spiritual, but like not. But in his situation, there's this article that came out in 2008 called "Lacking Control Increases Illusory Pattern Perception." Yeah, and I saw you referenced that in one of your articles, which is, yeah, because when we have a feeling of lack of control, we do scan for where is the threat and where are the possible resources, and this is dopamine is involved in that seeking information, right? And so this guy, he was worried, like, am I going crazy thinking that other people know my circumstances, or that thinking that God is testing me by hidden messages, that they know my circumstances and the way that they behave. There's all these hidden referential idea messages, plus also they know my internal world. He was like at the same time interested, but scared of what that might mean, but also scared he might be going crazy, right? Because he was like, another part was noticing that thing going on, that phenomenon, and worried he was losing his mind. And, so it's like, either this is true and there's some big spiritual conspiracy thing to connect me with my family, because or it's a test, or I'm going crazy. And neither of these options are particularly interesting. So tapping into this other part of himself where he could have a different explanation, whereas and he's not terribly sophisticated or psychologically enlightened fellow, but just to offer him an IFS, but and IFS for psychosis type of explanation, like, is it possible that you miss your family so much that you're finding patterns that helps you feel connected both to the trials of your life, but also to them? And his system immediately, and I'm coming from not I'm giving an explanation and I have the explanation, but really just like a curious, calm, just offering, like, take it if you want, you don't have to. And his system immediately went, "Phew," immediately calmed, right? Um, so a lot of it is, like Stephanie's saying, is it's so much more about us embodying self-energy as much as we can and offering what we can, coming from a place of open collaboration, and probably another C could be collaboration, of with somebody. Okay. And so that scanning for what's going on in here, what is it connecting to there, often, like, there's a couple ways I think that we get to feeling people know what our internal thoughts are. One is trauma type intrusions, like people like know and be, as been so vulnerable that people know what the hell's going on because they're really intruding into you, and or they're gaslighting you during this whole process to hide the abuse that they were doing to you. And another one is like you're scanning the environment for like, oh, and you're noticing these intense coincidences. I just had this thought that I noticed that in my environment. I wonder if there's a coincidence. And then you build on like, well, what if there is blah, blah, blah. And that sort of ego boundary opens up a little too much. Or you're having either voices or audible thoughts. Now the voices, like they seem to be like maybe acoustic or at least out there and not from you, and they're talking about your internal experience. So like, yeah, somebody, some agency knows what the hell's going on in here, or you're hearing your own thoughts. So shit, if I hear my own thoughts, who else might? Right? And then you get vigilant about like who could know, and then you're finding the clues that confirm that not good hypothesis. The other thing too is that you feel if somebody's so isolated, one of the best predictors for any kind of psychotic symptoms is loneliness. Like this poor guy stuck here, homeless refugee, his loneliness factor was humongous. And for that trying to meet that need, like a protector, pattern finding protector, trying to meet that need of some sort of connection, even if it's, other parts of it, like that's crazy, dude.
Okay. Yeah, I do want to shift now to dealing with some of the questions. And so feel free to type more questions in there, and I might skip around through them. But one question is from Elizabeth, who's asking, do you have recommendations for clinical teams who are dubious about clients being ready for therapeutic work? Like they might think, oh, they're too traumatized for trauma work or too psychotic to work with their psychosis. How do you respond to a clinician saying it would be dangerous to give this person the idea that they have parts, or even that their psychotic experiences might be meaningful? I could take an initial shot at that. I would point out that maybe it's like trying to not get into like being able to notice that they have parts is dangerous because it makes them more crazy, it makes the whole thing seem crazier. Whereas if you just kind of like normalize, hey, we all have parts, part of me wants to go this way and part of me doesn't, and parts doesn't have to be anything very exotic, but it still helps normalize, hey, it's common not to be all on one page in our mind, and then the idea that people are too traumatized or too psychotic to work with stuff. I think, the evidence from the therapy has been shown in research to be generally helpful, and, is what I would turn to. And
yeah. I'd add to that, just like it's reminding me of a conversation, like a group meeting. It's like, it's just after taking it was before like a little bit of a hearing voices, but informed a lot by voice dialogue training with a hearing voices guy. And actually just giving an example of a conversation of a client that I had, super bright young guy who, at the second conversation, like one such and such voice who has a name shows up, what emotion is there? And he said, well, anger. Is that angry at you? No, it's angry at these social circumstances which are normal to be angry at. And he's very insightfully said, well, this voice carries the anger for me because I don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
I'm like, dude, that's brilliant. So, and then a couple sessions later, I had a conversation with the angry voice thing. He was sort of not there. And then he came back and I read him back the notes from my questions, the angry voice or the anger carrying voice that had a name. I read it back to him, like a 12-minute conversation, and he was able to recall that
Yeah.
from living it, right?
And
And just I
also,
expose that to the group to say, like, this is possible. We don't have to fear this, but it takes a little while for people to feel like, oh, that's doable.
and also, Ron, as far as the team stuff goes, I think for me, when people ask me that, I don't always use past language at first. When I say I'm being the self to the client system, I really am. The main thing I'm doing is I'm listening very, very carefully to what they're telling me and reflecting back in ways and then asking questions so that I'm tracking their parts even before they're able to. So, it's just more of a way of really understanding the distress. When people feel understood and heard, they start to feel less distressed. And then all of a sudden, presto, this person who they're saying is too psychotic for therapeutic work is less psychotic. Ronald Lang talks about the fact that, a lot of his clients weren't particularly psychotic when they were in the room with him because he made it safe, right? So, and I've definitely seen that phenomena that Matt Ball's idea of dissociotic, right? Only when it feels unsafe in the relational space do I need to even use psychosis as a barrier between you and I. Is kind of how I hold that, just I'm here with you and I'm listening and I'm curious and I think you're an amazing human being and you get to feel that from me.
So somebody's asking what's the biggest differences for working with IFS with a client with dissociative identity disorder versus psychotic disorder. And then they're also curious about what happens when psychotic symptoms decrease or go away. What does that actually look like? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
It's really interesting, the service where I work, right? Because sometimes people are coming in like with psychosis, like hearing voices. I'm thinking about one young lady in particular who was hearing voices initially. But she also had a presentation where she found herself, like, Montreal has a river and in winter it gets cold, so there's ice on it. So she found herself standing in the middle of a river in February and did not know how she got there. So my little ding was going, okay, this young lady's got DID. It shows up, its parts are showing up as voices initially, but it took a little while for her to then like shift from DID to OSDD type 1, as if these categories make sense, but it's on a continuum, right? She would have less and less absences. Her main self, recalling continuous self, would be less put in the trunk of the car as somebody else was driving, and she'd maybe even be in the back seat but still observing. And it's different because initially it can look like psychosis, but if we give space, like, okay, we're going to take it from a parts point of view, whether or not we throw another label at it, diagnostic label, just to be curious to see, how it will pan out. I have another, but rarely do I have clients with DID or OSDD type 1 who get psychotic, but sometimes it does. The biggest thing that people who have very polarized and amnesia-causing parts, the biggest thing they need, like you were just saying just now, Stephanie, is feeling understood. And not just by the clinician, but by people around them. And when they feel like, oh, you get that I have a variety of parts. And one guy I was working with, he had a lot of trauma. He had 36. He did not have problems with them. They were each musically talented and they would jam, And it was not a problem when he was living with his dad and stepmom because they got it and it was fine. But when he was living with mom did not get it and would be really angry, and that would not be good. So a lot of it is just this understanding, and like there's interesting stuff if you want to look up. Like there's a whole movement about plurality and multiplicity where we're not pathologizing it, like an IFS. But IFS will still have like, when there is these conflicts, we can work on it. But I have another client with clear DID.
Thomas, can I interrupt you? Because we come on time and I want to say something too. And then we need to get on to some other questions. So, what I wanted to say about the difference between DID and psychosis is, broadly, I would personally say that from an ISPS perspective, just different strategies from different protectors. Maybe Dick Schwartz would disagree with that. I don't know, but that's how I'm currently holding it. But to be honest, I don't really care for labels. So like, I don't necessarily like find that I need to necessarily start to think about this is a discrete something that I just feel like I'm with a person in the room and I'm going to respond to whatever they're bringing me as the clinician. And so, or as the IFS practitioner or whatever. And so whatever's here, I can be with. And if the person's like, as Thomas said, amnesia making parts, then I just want to be curious about that and find out what feels safe in that space. And then if a person is having psychosis, what feels safe in that space. And then really importantly, your question, I wanted to pop back to that question around what happens when they have less psychosis. Well, that's when the real healing work happens in my mind. And so for me, that first period of time where they're just getting to know parts is one thing. And I will use a quick example of a client that I have who came in and he really believed he was a bad person. And he was doing a lot of things like food restricting, wouldn't eat unless food was brought to him. So he wasn't eating a lot because, unless food came into his house somehow. So in the end, his mum found out what was going on, was bringing him food. But it was a way, because he believed in this karmic order that was going to atone for if he had a certain way of eating and consuming things, other kinds of things, not only food, then that would atone for this sense of badness. And obviously the badness feeling came from very young, but then some choices had been made in his late teens that he felt were kind of proved his badness. And as we unpacked it, about 12 months into the work together, I said to him, would you like to hear what I think? And because we'd sort of been talking a little bit about parts and a little bit about voices and a little bit about his beliefs and bouncing around things. And he couldn't see anyone else as bad, only himself, and really had to idealize a lot of, family members and things. And about 12 months in, I said, would you like to hear what I think? And I said, I think that there was a part of you who we've heard in little snippets. And I know it's really scary for you to get close to listening to that part. But that part made the choices that you feel so ashamed of and beat yourself up about from a really constrained place where that part was very afraid. And I said, and I don't think that makes you a bad person. And at that point in time, and it felt therapeutically correct to do that, by the way, but he found that so offensive. He told me I was completely wrong, that that was absolutely not the case, and then went on to tell me about the quantum reality and these forces and this what Matt Ball would call the dissociotic moment, right? Great. I just went, oh, good. Thanks for letting me know that. I'm wrong. Then about another year into the therapy, there was this place where I said to him again, do you want to know what I think? And I said virtually the same thing. And he said to me, that is the most compassionate thing I've ever heard. And it was the beginning of him. And he actually, we spent various times throughout we had a lot of time where we just talk, and then we have these times when we have let's chunk down on how you perceive your experiences, and we'll go through this long process of unpacking. And he actually took one of those sessions where we're unpacking and put it to music, and he titled the thing Maybe I'm Not Bad. It was an incredibly beautiful and powerful moment for him. And so for me, that's when the real healing work comes. And so recently we've been talking, because he's much less psychotic now. And he said to me, my protectors are just very afraid to go to that boy who believed he was bad, because I'm afraid I'm going to do bad things again if I don't keep believing it. So now we're just into the actual work. So that's the answer to that question.
Yeah, that is kind of leads to a segue to another question. That someone is enviously hears that we work with some or most of our clients for years, and they work in an environment where they have to provide time-limited therapy, no more than 6 to 9 months or 20 to 30 sessions. And would you even start doing IFS with psychotic clients with such time constraints? And I could jump in with my answer, which is yes, that you would do what the person seems available for. And because you can often make, like, as you can help the person have a little more sense of being able to just be calm and curious and compassionate towards what's going on in themselves, that can make progress. And often you can do that. And the first step is often to help the person not be overwhelmed, because if the person is if the person is feeling overwhelmed, they're going to be in fight or flight mode and forget trying to be compassionate and curious. You don't want to be compassionate and curious when your house is on fire. But once they find a way to not feel overwhelmed, which for some people might take a long time, but for other people, maybe not, maybe, then maybe you will be able to jump in to do some work. Again, what you'd be able to do in that period of time would probably be limited. And hopefully you would steer them towards, okay, we got some stuff started, you've got something going, there's different ways you could continue this work. Because really often people's real recovery journey takes years, whether they're seeing a therapist that whole time or not. It does take years.
Yeah. I would just add one thing to that. If there's the psychotherapy part, and then there's also if the person has psychosocial needs that are maintaining their stress levels and these extreme parts reacting, get a social worker involved so that those psychosocial needs can be met. Because it's really hard. One of the key things about doing IFS or any actually probably good therapy is really make sure that those basic Maslowian needs are taken care of as best as possible. So that's the social worker part of me chiming in there. Yeah.
I don't have anything to add, but I will just say for the recording, thank you for the people who knew that term, the unthought known was what I was trying to say. And it's important to say it because it captures it beautifully. It's known, it just hasn't come into thought yet. Unthought known by Christopher Bollas.
Yeah. Okay. And someone's asking an example of how an initial discussion might go with a client. And I know that obviously could vary a lot depending on what's going on. I'll just throw again my initial 2 cents here, which is that one metaphor for what you do in your initial setting is if you picture somebody, riding along on their horse, and what we want to do is come up alongside them for a bit at first and just ride alongside them and just see what it takes to do that and show that we can kind of like follow them a bit. That's the first thing. And then it might come out that as we're following them, that we just casually notice, like let's say we notice a conflict. Oh, it seems like, part of you is really sure everyone's after you, and part of you thinks maybe that's your paranoia. Is that right? That's an initial. So that's my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah. I would just add to that. Sometimes, like I present it like, even if it sounds like a strange way to language it, but we are our own like internal teams. And sometimes that team can be really chaotic and like against each other. And what I hope to offer is that you get greater harmony, like with your team, and you get better teamwork, and that maybe even you could feel like you're the leader of that team. And a lot of people resonate with that.
That's nice. Yeah, I like that. For me, first sessions, first of all, don't think you're going to understand. If someone's coming in and they're quite psychotic and you try and understand them, I have this beautiful friend who's a psychiatrist, and he said to me once, when clients start to say stuff that I don't understand, I get really dissociated. And I'm like, good that you notice that, okay? Because that's your stuff right there. And so for me, the only thing that I'm doing is I'm doing a bunch of things. I was trained in emotionless CPR, but I know that there's a whole bunch of people who use different forms of that. Like I just want to honor the different schools. I know that there's like intentional peer support and different things, but for me, I'm coming into my body constantly. So if I feel myself leaning in too much, trying to understand, or leaning up back too much, like going, okay, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, I'm wanting to notice that in my body, and make sure I can kind of come back into, I do not have to try and figure anything out for this person right now. The other thing I'll say is that so my presence is important. The other thing is I'm really honestly feeling into a felt sense. And maybe that's the only thing I'm reflecting back at first is like, wow, it sounds really scary at the moment. It sounds like there's a lot of, I mean, I don't know what I would say, but I'm reflecting feeling state. I'm also reflecting what's going on in me. When I hear you say that, it feels so heavy, which is an ECPR thing, right? And the person might literally say, me too, right? They might be feeling that and don't have words. So I think it's about attunement, more than anything. All I'm doing is wanting to track that I'm not getting dissociated or blended with parts, that I'm staying grounded, don't have to fix.
Yeah, notice and some of you might have already had to leave actually, but we have just a few more questions. Maybe we can, and if somebody has a last question, you could quick type it in. But here's one question is like, do we work with families in developing the ability to communicate in a compassionate way and work towards maybe the willingness for therapy themselves? But I think especially like how can families communicate in a compassionate way? Do you guys work with families at all?
I do.
You know, I do. And yeah, I think as if family members can, I mean, you also have to help them maybe not be overwhelmed, but then come from a place instead of trying to control everything, as Thomas was talking about, if control isn't needed right away, because in an emergency, you might really need to control things. But if it's not an emergency, okay, how can you be curious? How can you ride alongside? Oh, you're thinking of it differently than I do, but let me understand how you're thinking and what's that like for you. And just that does a lot. And just that, hey, there's more than one way of looking at things. It sounds like you're really worried it might be this, but and maybe being curious has they ever considered looking at it any other way, or does some part of you look at it some other way? Just that kind of stuff can help, and family members can do those kind of basic things. That's some initial thoughts from me.
Yeah. And I would totally just be on the same wavelength with that, Ron, because and just to add the comment that like what we're doing is we're modeling. When the family is there witnessing, if the person's cool with the family being there witnessing our conversation, it's like how to model how to relate to the person who's having intense, strange experiences so that they can feel like, oh, okay, maybe I could do a little bit of that, but I'm still not the therapist. And then still like you were saying, Stephanie, too, is like sometimes talking not from our own parts. Like this is a nuance for the interpersonal aspect of IFS, which is especially in couples therapy, but applies elsewhere, where we can notice when we're getting into like a part of ourselves is like a protector part or whatever, like dissociating or managing or whatever is kind of taken over a bit, is to say like, I'm noticing there's a part of me that wants to do this, wants to tune out, wants to take control, but because people pick up on that, right? So it's better just to like, especially when people have high reactive antennae to threat, is to be totally transparent and to say like, yeah, there's a part of me that is doing that right now, and I'm asking it to step aside so I can be with you, right? And we can also model that for family members.
Yeah, nice. There's a couple of things I talk to the family members about is things like the negation reflex. There's a great article on paranoia and the negation reflex, and that if we kind of try to negate someone, they kind of end up needing to hunker down on their position. And so curiosity is really important. That's a bit later. At first, I'm much more interested in the whole family dynamic and seeing if the family can see the way that they create those dissociotic moments, those moments where the person dissociates into metaphoric language. Because often what will happen is something is being said in the session that's very clear and very powerful, and then one family member will just say something that's really triggering to the person. All of a sudden they're telling us about how the CIA is after them. And it's like, let's slow down. What just happened? And hopefully I at the moment, when I work with families, I'm working with the individual and then I bring in the family. So I know their system really, really well. And I'll see if there's permission for me to say to that person, does it feel okay right now to find out what just happened? And most times they're quite willing in front of their family to unpack something with me. And then the invitation is whether the family member can cope with what they're hearing, which is usually what they said and did impacted that person. And there's a lot of times when there's a lot of fragility from the family around they don't want to hurt and harm, that they love their loved one. And at the same time, they can easily go to blaming themselves, which is not what we're trying to do. So for me, it's, but I encourage all family members, all the main, well, I encourage them to go to IFS therapy, basically. So, mostly at the moment, I'm working with a family member where it's mainly the mum. She's going off to have therapy on her own parts.
Well, it's kind of relates to what we were just talking about. For somebody writing that they don't understand why IFS seems to model that it must take a long time to heal. Many examples of people with serious problematic behaviors, including what we call psychosis, might heal after just a few sessions, just as what occurs due to some experiences that reorients the person to be able to be in touch with their authentic self regularly when stress triggers them into some altered state. And psychedelic assisted therapy has been effectively used with highly trained indigenous shamans, etc. It's, I guess, I know it's like a lot of people, of course, are saying you can't use psychedelics with people with psychosis, which I think is a really shaky area that we need to talk about a lot more. And like, when might somebody be ready, and when aren't they ready? And but as far as, I think people can have really important healing experiences. And actually, I mean, sometimes people come in so different. I mean, in open dialogue, they talk about how sometimes they had what seemed like one session cures, like where they just find a way to talk about the thing that was people were scared to be talking about. And all of a sudden, something isn't exiled anymore. It's out there and people can deal with it. And that does it. But more often, I think people have more complex stuff that they have to work through. But the thing is like, in some sense, healing, we're always working on stuff. I mean, I think all of us here still have stuff we're working on. I mean, I don't feel like I'm, like in any kind of like bad state. My life is good, but there's still stuff I'm working on. So I don't know. It is a complex question. So I appreciate pointing out that, yeah, things don't necessarily always take really long, but yet they often do. And it depends. I don't know. What do you guys think?
And I don't think that IFS teaches that it takes a long time. So I'm not sure where that person got that idea from, but I can hear that we are talking about that a little bit today, and it can sound like that, but that's not the perspective of IFS. The other thing I'll say is, I had one woman, because I'll be starting research soon, and I was chatting to some folks about, come to my research. And there was one woman who said to me that one of the most helpful things for her was the compassion of self, that when her voices get really big and scary, if she just literally says, I love you, doesn't get caught in trying to argue with them in the way she used to. She said they just feel so much better, and they feel less afraid and less aggressive. And so it's kind of like a win-win. She's like, everyone else in her system is happy. The voice feels held and understood. And that's purely from her self-energy saying, I'm hearing you and I love you, even though I'm, whatever the voice is telling her that's kind of mean.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Somebody had a question about distinguishing between voices or audible thoughts. In fact, I'll dabble in that very quickly, if that's okay. What I always do with clients is I do like every freaking client because they come to they've gone to the emergency or they've seen their doctor and they talk about voices, right? And then there's that actual assumption like, oh, you have auditory verbal hallucinations. Well, let's take a second and tease that out. So I do a little table. It's like 2 columns. right? One side is thoughts, and the other side are these perceptions, like you hear them with your ears type of, and there are thoughts that are verbal thoughts. Okay. Just to be like talking to yourself, remembering, imagining conversations, practicing conversations, whatever. Once, verbal thoughts, and whether these are heard or not. And then I break it down to like levels of, for both columns, how much of like, is this you or is this somebody else? And then it's like more you is on the top. So sometimes people have, I talk to myself, and like we all do, but sometimes certain of those thoughts, they seem to change registers and slide over and being like, maybe I'm hearing it. But voices would be something else where you're further down, where it doesn't feel like it's you. And it may or may not be perceptualized. When it's really not you, but it's somebody out there in the world, that would be like an inserted thought. But if it's somebody out there in the world and you can hear them, then that's technically auditory verbal hallucinations. And then there's this middle zone of like, I hear it, and I know it's only coming from me, but it's not really me, but it might be a part of me. So it might be more dissociative or a part. And sometimes those show up like in the room, like literally out there, but sometimes just inside. And what is that? Where do we draw the line? What is psychosis or not? Well, there's first rank symptoms. It's like anything other than, my thought in my world is anything other than that is psychotic. But, Schneider didn't believe in dissociation. So anyway, so that's how we tease it out. And I always use that sort of table with folks, and people are really, really good at going like, actually, I don't have any auditory verbal hallucinations. I do have some audible thoughts, I think, I'm not sure, but I definitely have parts of myself. Sometimes I hear them, sometimes not. Sometimes they have inserted thoughts, but not that often. So that's kind of how we map it out. And those are just like for the form content, but not in the content, how long they've been there, the nature of these people, anything like that. Just the form. If that answers the question.
It can get quite complex. Like I usually don't identify as a person who hears voices, but I hear like within myself, parts of me, what I consider parts of me, but they will maintain they are not parts of me. I'm like, okay, well, you don't like to think that you're part of me. I understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all cool.
That helps me to understand a lot, Ron, about, this is a bigger conversation and I know we have to finish now, but that helps me to understand some of your questions about UBs and people's parts who don't think that they're part of them. But it feels like that those parts are part of you.
Yeah, and someone's asking that also in the question and answer, that they know that unattached burdens are rare, but curious what the panelists thought of UBs and people going through psychosis. I think it's a really complicated thing. We could probably talk about a lot, but it's so common for people to have stuff that they're experiencing that they don't think is them. But as they work with it, that often shifts. And it might be that there's, even when you find something that never does identify as part of the person, it still could be, we can be agnostic about it. Like, that part doesn't seem to identify as, can't identify any positive role and doesn't believe it's part of you. Okay, maybe there's another way we can work with it. Like send it love, let it go somewhere where it belongs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Other comments on that?
Yeah, well, I suppose I will speak to the IFS perspective around unattached burdens, and I will say that for me, I'm always wanting to stay close to the client's experience. I really am not interested in negating a client's experience. So if a person feels like there is a voice or an entity or a being or whatever, part that isn't themselves, first of all, most times if a client comes in saying that to me, I'm a little bit skeptical. It sounds like a manager has made that decision about another part. And so we want to spend a fair bit of time getting to know the part who first of all thinks that and why it thinks that, and then seeing if we can go to the part that they think is not a part of them and get to know that part. And we spend quite a bit of time asking questions to ascertain why it's here, what role it does, why it does its role, to see if there is any sniff of a positive intention, even if for quite a long time it says, no, I'm just here to destroy that person or whatever. We want to say, but yes, but why? Why is it important? You know, like, how long have you been here trying to destroy this person? Because, you know, sometimes I'll say I want this person to be away from their pain. But, you know, if it continues that way and it is just like, no, I'm just here to destroy them because they're a vile, worthless creature or something. Again, I'm going to spend a lot of time going like, how did you come to know that? And it's only after quite a long time that we would sort of say I would start to kind of wonder if maybe this part isn't, you know, a part in their system. And then I might say, are you a part of the, you know, client, Pedro? And if it says no, then we do have a protocol in IFS for releasing these unattached beings to the light where they can heal, actually. And I think it's, for me, important there's two things. We don't want to, I think there's a trap in IFS, and unfortunately too many people are being trained in IFS and getting a little bit caught up into too quickly noticing UBs or legacy burdens. I had a woman the other day, okay, I'm totally blended with the judgy part now. I had a person speak to me about how this therapist say to me, oh, I'm having a lot of legacy burdens come through my office at the moment. And I was a bit like, I don't know. I mean, that could be just an energetic thing, I suppose, but I also feel a little bit dubious about how are you sniffing out all these legacy burdens in so many different clients? Is that a bias that you're holding and you're kind of seeing them? Because for me, I wait until the client's telling me that this isn't only their burden, it's something from their family or their social context or some, you know, social family burden, cultural family burden. So the same thing with, you know, that is a pitfall in IFS, is that these people who are new in the model are, you know, kind of seeing UBs under every rock, right? So we don't want to do that, but we also don't want to negate someone's reality. And for me, I want to finish by just explaining how deeply healing it was for me, because I have had my own experience of a UB. My mother didn't want me to be born. I was an inconvenient pregnancy for various reasons I won't go into, just for my family's privacy. And she really wished me not born. And I had a sense when I was growing up, apart from all the abuse and the pain and difficulties I had, which definitely could have made me feel like something was out to get me, because a lot of people were out to get me as far as the abuse. I had multiple abuses. But I had a deeper sense that just like there was some entity. I had a part who believed bad things come get me. And when we worked with that part for a fairly long time, and eventually I can't remember the session and how it went fully, other than we got to a place of realizing this was not just a belief of a part. This was actually some sense of an entity actually was coming to get me. And so when that was released, and when we asked that entity why it came in, it said, I came on the bidding of your mother. It had no good intention. It was just here to destroy me. And now, whatever framework you believe that through, whether you believe I'm making up stories and this is a mental construct, whether you believe like I do that it was a spiritual experience, I don't really mind. Ultimately, the level of healing that I felt from the experience of having that entity go to the light, that was night and day. The part of me who held the fear, bad things come get me and I am not safe in the world, pivoted her belief from bad things come get me to people are scary and I could still be harmed. But no longer am I afraid of just the world. Like, the world was terrifying to me. And I think that is what I don't want to see lost in any concern that we have around a person who is having, you know, is saying, you know, this isn't a part of me. I don't want to jump too quickly to assuming it's a UB. I also don't want to discount or say that it's not. And you know, to be honest, if we let something go to the light and then it's back, well, I believe, Ron and Thomas, because I know you guys don't necessarily agree with me, that I believe that the system is self-correcting. So if we make a blunder, the system will tell us. And if we accidentally let go of a UB and actually it wasn't, the system will tell us you made a mistake.
Yeah. And I've worked in an agnostic way too. Like somebody has something in them that they believe is the ghost of their abuser. And I'm saying kind of like, well, like I hear that's a possibility. And then maybe it's also possible there's some part of you that took on being the abuser, and who knows, maybe even it's a little of both. And so if it's like the abuser, we want them to move on to where they belong. And if it's the part of you, we want to make peace with it. We might even have to do both, but and then you just kind of work with it. And there's so many different cultural views. I think IFS can be used in a flexible way. Like how many people believe that, culturally, just that spirits talk to you, your ancestors talk to you. I know a psychiatrist who said it wasn't until he went to medical school he heard that most people don't hear their ancestors talk to them. Well, that's weird. So we don't have to tell them, no, your ancestors don't talk to you. It's just a part or something like that. Just like, okay, there's different ways of looking at it and different, so that, I guess there's lots more we could talk about, but
Yeah.
we've gotten through most of what people had.
I would just add, if anything, it just reminded me of this guy I work with, right, who's very spiritual, and he's come to that. And for him, like I was saying earlier, he creates this space in his being of a lot of self energy, and whatever these are, like he has his own explanatory framework for it, and it's like not my job to convince him that's wrong. Like I don't know, but his way of relating to himself is staying super grounded, a lot of self energy, and whatever these things are, in the IFS protocols, you send them to the light because these are more powerful and somebody more powerful will take care of them. In his space, it's like, no, I can, I just create this space that's healing for them. They do whatever level of healing they need and then they move on. Right. Which is like, that's cool. Yeah.
And Thomas, can I just say what I love about that example is as you followed his lead, you said he's now getting to the trauma work. So
yep.
That for me, I mean, obviously I'm a trauma therapist and I'm biased, and that's always my bias. But I think that's the key, right? It's like there's something about he's healing something in his system to the point now where there's some sense of being able to turn towards I think is probably some of the core of it. But of course, I don't know the client, but that's my bias is what I'm speaking for.
Yeah, and whatever that, like, it's one way to think about it is he's practicing with whatever these entities are, wherever the hell that's coming from. Like, we don't need to know; it doesn't matter, because because the key is him working on having that so much self energy that he can practice with those things, and then in that space, his own stuff's going to come up and do its healing, right? But it's so much about cultivating that space, right?
Cultivating that space with other people too, helping people get ready to be in self as they deal with their family or as they deal, that can also be really healing work. Somebody's asking about the power of creatively expressing parts and voices, which I think can be fun. That could be a whole workshop, but and yeah, so but anyway. Final thoughts, or I could also say, final thoughts from you guys. Anything you want to say to wrap it up? Or I really appreciate you coming here and sharing your thoughts here, and I appreciate the people that attended and joined in and asked questions.
I don't have anything. I just think it's been just a lovely conversation. I feel like I covered off almost everything that I would have hoped to have. I've been really grateful for both of your sharings as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, me too. And thank you, Stephanie, for initially reaching out so that we could have our dialogues. And then, thank you, Ron. It's always cool to follow the stuff and how, you're constructing stuff over a while. So really grateful to be part of this conversation. And Yeah, thanks.
All right. Okay. Take care, everybody. We'll send out the recording when it's ready. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
A question that came up with, just to give you guys a heads up, but a question that came up with a colleague. I don't know if he's going to be on or not, but I thought it was a good question, and maybe I would ask it if there was, a need for more questions or something, is how this way of working is like or not like object relations, which those of us that have been around longer or people that have gone to institutes, they might, it seems, but I only know your approach superficially, but it seems like it might be a lot of overlap, and that might be interesting to especially the people that have been in the field a long time.
Yeah. And actually, Julia, I love that question because these days I'm like, wait a minute, this stuff has been around since the 40s and 50s, right?
Everything's been around forever.
Well, yeah, I mean, even, with Janet, right? So, yeah. I mean, I could speak to that a little bit right now, and then we can come back to it at some point. I think one of the main things is a few things, like I would say three things. One is there's a process to IFS that is very clearly delineated and smooth, right?
Mhm.
And the emphasis is more on the process than on the theory, because like it's hard to read. Like there's a lot of stuff written on object relations. Some of it's clearer, some of it less so. Sutherland is wonderfully clear, but it's not that clear on how they do it,
Uh-huh. Mhm.
right? Like the model of, you know, these different parts, blah, blah, blah. It's not that, it's the theory is clear, but how they go about helping the person distinguish and then relate to and how these different parts. Second thing is, because Dick Schwartz was coming from family systems, so much of the emphasis is on how these parts relate to each other. And in their intensification of their sort of like a family squabble, self can get really exiled, and trauma holding, maybe younger parts that have been carrying trauma for a long time, they're more in exile because it's like a little scared kid listening to parents arguing. And they're like, yeah, I'm just going to go back into the closet or downstairs into the basement and, bury myself type of thing. So it's a lot of it is that process helps delineate the interactions between these parts. Plus also, if we're sticking with the sort of the therapist trying to be in self as much as possible and helping the person be distinguishing their self from these protective and exiled parts, then the person is interrupting that interaction so they can go with one protector like, yeah, I really hear you, I'm unblending from you, and I really get your concerns. Is it okay if I go to this other part that you're in argument with? And it's like it's like self getting into a place of distinguishing from, first of all, protectors, and then mediate. Well, it's not even mediating, but sort of interrupting like in a family squabble, right? Like let's hear each one at a time, their concerns, and eventually those parts feeling enough trust in the sort of central balanced self. For that central balanced self, or the ego from object relations theory, which has very similar ideas about self, to be able to go and retrieve and take care of that isolated part that's been isolated, exiled, feeling miserable, ashamed, etc., and reconnecting with. And another thing that's really interesting is the notion of burdens. So parts will be carrying burdens, but they often are blended with the burden. So it's like teasing out the burden that they've been carrying so that burden can go back to where it needs to go. or
Mhm.
just into nature, and nature will metabolize it type of. So it's and that's a really pretty clear process for all those different steps.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm curious though, Julie. So for me, I'm curious about how do you and your friend perceive object relations, and how do you perceive IFS as the same, or similar? Because I think it would be good to address the specific similarities you see.
Mhm.
And then we can kind of say, yes, it is, and no, it's not. Because I think it is.
Mhm.
I think that one of the things that there's a gentleman in the IFS community who's just started a group, IFS and psychodynamic.
Mhm.
What has he called it? Ideas, approaches. I think it was approaches.
Yeah.
And
Something like that.
looking at that, because I also am informed psychodynamically and object relations, and I
Mhm.
do some training on that because it's not talked about enough in the IFS space. But it's IFS has a lot of, I don't know what the word is for it. It's almost like the foundation. We don't talk about it, but the foundation is there. But I'm curious, the question that I really am asking is, how do you see the similarities?
Mm.
Well, again, I don't really know IFS. I'm
Hmm.
going to find out more about it tonight. And let's see. I just feel like object relations approach was so basic to my learning and my training as a therapist that, uh, well, it's hard to even say, but that idea of internalized objects that are, probably, not clearly your father is internalized, but pieces of different experiences and people are internalized and getting in your
Right.
way or
Well,
or
that's a much clearer question to me, and that feels a lot easier to answer. And what I would say about that piece is that um, what I love about IFS is it's sort of like yes and just about everything. It's kind of like, is IFS like voice dialogue? It's like yes and so much more. Is it like, has it got some psychodynamic underpinnings and some things we can draw on? Yes, and so much more. And like Thomas said, we've got this lovely protocol that once you learn it and you can let go of it because you don't want to protocol someone, right? But you do want to
yeah.
do a process with them, holding the protocol very loosely. But
Mhm.
we have this way of kind of like, I think, Thomas, I thought I understood what you were saying is like object relations doesn't really tell you how to work with someone. It just is a theory. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, at least I mean, there's training and then there's what's written about it. So I haven't had
Mhm.
their
Yeah.
training, but
Yeah.
from what I've read, right, it's not that
Yes.
clear.
And my